Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a sound that exists only in the void between stars. It is not a roar, nor a scream, nor the grinding of metal upon metal, though all of those things can be heard if you listen carefully enough. It is something deeper, something older, something that crawls beneath the skin of reality and settles into the marrow of your bones like frost creeping across a window pane on a winter morning. It is the sound of a space hulk breathing. Now I know what you are thinking. Ships do not breathe. Metal does not exhale. The wreckage of 1,000 vessels fused together in the nightmare currents of the warp should not possess anything resembling life, let alone the steady rhythmic pulse of something that draws air into its lungs and pushes it out again. And you would be right, in the strictest sense. A space hulk is not alive. It is not a creature. It is not a being with thoughts or desires or any semblance of will, but it is also not entirely dead. Not in the way that a broken sword is dead, or a discarded boot, or a pile of rubble. A space hulk exists in that terrible grey space between existence and oblivion. That liminal zone where the laws of physics start to fray at the edges and the boundary between what is real and what is not becomes uncomfortably thin. And tonight, we are going to step inside one. We are going to walk its corridors. We are going to breathe its recycled air. We are going to feel the vibration of its hull beneath our feet and listen to the distant, muffled groans of metal plates shifting against one another as the warp tugs at its body like a tide pulling at a ship anchored in shallow water. We are going to meet the things that live within it, the creatures that call its labyrinthine passages home, the survivors who have built entire civilizations in its belly, and the horrors that drift through its darker reaches, like memories that refuse to fade. This is a story about what it means to be trapped, not behind bars, or within walls, or in any of the conventional ways that mortals experience captivity. This is about being trapped inside a mountain of dead ships that drifts through the most hostile environment in the known galaxy, a place where time does not behave as it should, where the walls themselves can change between one heartbeat and the next, and where the only certainty is that nothing is certain at all. So settle in, get comfortable, close your eyes if you like. Though I would not blame you for wanting to keep them open. The dark places we are about to visit tend to feel a little closer when you cannot see them coming. Let us begin. In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, there are many things that inspire fear. The tyrannid hive fleets, those vast swarms of alien organisms that consume entire worlds and leave nothing behind but barren rock. The chaos gods, those ancient entities of pure malice that dwell within the warp and reach their tendrils into the minds of the weak and the desperate. The necrons, those soulless machines of living metal that slumber beneath the surface of 1,000 worlds, waiting for the signal to rise and reclaim a galaxy they once ruled. All of these things are terrifying in their own right, and all of them have claimed countless lives across the millennia. But there is something about a space hulk that touches a different kind of fear altogether. It is not the fear of being devoured or corrupted or torn apart by forces beyond comprehension. It is something more primal than that, more fundamental. It is the fear of being lost, the fear of wandering through endless corridors that all look the same, of turning corner after corner and finding nothing but more darkness and more silence, and more of that terrible, aching emptiness that fills the spaces between dead ships, like water filling the hold of a sinking vessel. It is the fear of knowing that you are somewhere that no one will ever find you, that no signal you send will ever be received, that no prayer you whisper will ever reach the ears of anyone who might care enough to answer. A space hulk, at its most basic definition, it is a massive conglomeration of lost ships and wrecked vessels that have fused together over time as they drifted through the void of space and through the swirling currents of the warp. Think of it like a snowball rolling down a hill, gathering more snow as it goes, growing larger and heavier and more unwieldy with each passing moment. Except instead of snow, the material being gathered is the wreckage of warships and cargo freighters and exploration vessels and orbital stations and asteroid fragments and pieces of alien technology and chunks of planetary debris and anything else that has the misfortune of drifting into the gravitational pull of the growing mass. Over thousands of years, sometimes tens of thousands of years, these agglomerations grow to absolutely staggering proportions. Some space hulks are the size of small moons. Others rival asteroids in their dimensions. The largest recorded examples have been compared to dwarf planets, vast enough to possess their own gravitational fields, their own atmospheres generated by the leaking gases of 1,000 broken ships, and their own internal ecosystems born from the biological contamination of centuries of accumulated organic matter. They are, in every meaningful sense, worlds unto themselves, worlds without sunlight, worlds without hope, worlds where the only law that governs is the law of survival, and even that is a tenuous thing at best. The Imperium of man tracks the movements of known space hulks with the same wary attention that a sailor might give to a storm on the horizon. They emerge from the warp, seemingly at random, appearing in star systems without warning and drifting through inhabited space like enormous, silent threats. Sometimes they pass through without incident, their bulk too distant from any populated world to pose a direct danger. Other times, they drift directly into the path of shipping lanes or military installations or civilian settlements, and the Imperium is forced to respond. That response is never simple, and it is never safe. Because space hulks are not empty. They are never empty. Something always lives inside them, whether it is the descendants of crews that were aboard the original ships when they were swallowed by the warp, or alien organisms that have colonized the Hulk during its long journey through the immaterium, or worse things still, things born of the warp itself, creatures that exist in the spaces between reality and nightmare, entities that have no name in any language spoken by mortal tongues. And it is into this darkness that we must now descend. But before we do, let us take a moment to appreciate the sheer scale of what we are dealing with. The Imperium of man spans roughly 1 million worlds, give or take, scattered across a galaxy that measures 100,000 light-years from rim to rim. In such an incomprehensibly vast domain, it might seem like a few floating collections of space junk would be a minor concern, a footnote in the endless ledger of threats that the Lords of Terror must contend with on a daily basis. And yet, the strategic importance of space hulks is taken extremely seriously at the highest levels of Imperial command. Standing orders from the Navis Imperialis and the Imperial Navy itself require all forces and authorities to survey and report the location of any space hulk they detect. Entire departments within the administratum are devoted to tracking the movements of known hulks, maintaining vast databases that catalogue every appearance, every disappearance, every confirmed sighting across every sector of the Imperium. The reason for this level of attention is not difficult to understand. A single space hulk dropping out of the warp in the wrong place at the wrong time can trigger a catastrophe that costs billions of lives and takes decades to contain. We have seen it happen again and again throughout the long and bloody history of the Imperium. And every time it happens, the lesson is the same. Ignore a space hulk at your peril. Underestimate a space hulk at the cost of everything you hold dear. The Ordo Xenos of the Inquisition maintains its own records, classified at the highest levels of imperial security, that document the specific threats found within known space hulks. These records make for harrowing reading, even by the standards of an organization that deals routinely with the worst horrors the galaxy has to offer. They speak of infestations so vast that entire chapters of Space Marines have been consumed in the attempt to cleanse them. They describe populations of mutants and heretics so numerous and so deeply entrenched that the only viable option was the complete destruction of the Hulk, at a cost in naval resources that strained the capacity of entire sector fleets. Since they catalogue technologies recovered from within space hulks that pushed the boundaries of the Mechanicus's understanding and raised questions about the history of the galaxy that nobody was entirely comfortable asking. And they document the silences, the missions that never reported back, the boarding parties that entered the Hulk, and were never heard from again. The ships that docked with the Hulk's exterior and went dark. Their crews presumed dead, their fates unknown. These silences are, in many ways, more terrifying than the most dramatic accounts of combat and carnage, because they leave room for the imagination to fill in the details. And the imagination, when presented with the kind of raw material that a Space Hulk provides, tends to produce scenarios that are worse than anything that the truth could offer. Picture yourself standing at the entrance of a boarding torpedo that has just punched through the outer hull of a Space Hulk. The impact has thrown you forward against your restraints, and the sound of the breach is still ringing in your ears, a shrieking, tearing cacophony of metal being ripped apart by the force of your entry. The emergency lighting inside the torpedo casts everything in a harsh red glow, and through the freshly cut opening in the hull, you can see the interior of the Space Hulk for the first time. It is dark. Not the comfortable darkness of a room with the lights turned off, where you know that familiar things surround you, and the switch is only an arm's length away. This is a deeper darkness, an older darkness, a darkness that has weight and texture and substance, that presses against your eyes like a physical force and seems to swallow the beam of your lamp before it can travel more than a few meters. The air that flows in through the breach smells of rust and decay, and something else, something chemical and sharp that burns the back of your throat and makes your eyes water. It is the smell of centuries of stagnation, of atmospheres that have been recycled and re-recycled through failing filtration systems until they carry more toxins than oxygen, of biological processes that have been occurring in sealed chambers for longer than anyone can remember. And beneath it all, barely perceptible but impossible to ignore once you notice it, there is that sound, that slow, rhythmic pulse that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like the heartbeat of something immeasurably vast and impossibly old. Welcome to the Space Hulk. Welcome to your new home. Because here is the thing that the recruitment posters for the Imperial Navy never mention, and the sermons of the ecclesiarchy never touch upon, and the strategic briefings from Sector Command always gloss over with carefully chosen euphemisms. Once you go into a Space Hulk, there is no guarantee that you will ever come out again. The interior of these things is not like the interior of a normal ship, where corridors lead to predictable destinations and deck plans can be memorized, and navigation is simply a matter of following the right path from point A to point B. A Space Hulk is a maze built by madness and time, and the capricious whims of the warp. A three-dimensional labyrinth of interconnected passages and dead-end chambers and vertical shafts and sealed compartments and open voids and everything in between. Corridors that were straight when you walked down them 5 minutes ago might be curved when you try to retrace your steps. Doors that were open are now sealed. Rooms that were empty are now occupied. The very structure of the Hulk shifts and settles as different sections compress against one another under the influence of gravity and the residual energies of the warp, and what was a viable route 1 hour might be a collapsed tunnel of crushed metal the next. This is what it means to be trapped inside a Space Hulk. This is the reality that faces every creature, human or otherwise, that finds itself within the belly of one of these drifting leviathans. It is a reality defined by uncertainty, by darkness, by the constant, gnawing awareness that the world around you is not stable, not predictable, and not particularly interested in your continued survival. And that is just the beginning. There is so much more to tell, so much more darkness to explore. Let us go deeper. The first thing you need to understand about how a Space Hulk comes into being is that it does not happen quickly. There is no single catastrophic event that creates one of these things. No explosion or collision or act of deliberate construction that gives birth to a Space Hulk the way a shipyard gives birth to a warship. The process is slow, agonizingly, incomprehensibly slow. It happens over centuries, sometimes over millennia, sometimes over spans of time so vast that they make the entire recorded history of the Imperium of man look like a footnote in a much larger story. It begins, as so many terrible things in this galaxy begin, with the warp. The warp, the Immaterium, the Sea of Souls, that strange and terrifying dimension that exists alongside our own reality, like a dark reflection in a broken mirror. It is through the warp that the starships of the Imperium travel when they need to cross the vast distances between star systems, activating their warp drives to punch a hole in the fabric of reality and slipping through into that churning sea of psychic energy and raw emotion. It is a necessary evil, this method of travel, because the alternative, crawling between the stars at sublight speeds, would take thousands of years for even the shortest journeys. But it is also profoundly dangerous, because the warp is not empty space. It is not a vacuum through which ships can glide in safety and silence. It is alive, in a manner of speaking, filled with currents and tides and storms of psychic energy that can tear a ship apart as easily as a hurricane tears apart a fishing boat. And it is inhabited by things that hunger for mortal souls, the way a starving man hungers for bread. Every ship that enters the warp does so protected by a device known as a Geller field, a technology so ancient and so poorly understood that even the Adeptus Mechanicus, those obsessive custodians of humanity's scientific heritage, cannot fully explain how it works. The Geller field creates a bubble of real space around the ship, a zone where the physical laws of the material universe still apply, where gravity works the way it should, and time flows in the direction it is supposed to, and the creatures of the warp cannot reach in to claim the souls of those within. As long as the Geller field holds, the ship and its crew are protected, as long as it holds. But Geller fields fail. They flicker, they weaken, they collapse entirely at the worst possible moments when the ship is deep in the warp and surrounded on all sides by the hungry, howling entities that dwell there. When a Geller field fails, the results are catastrophic beyond description. Demons manifest aboard the ship in an instant, tearing through crew members and bulkheads alike with equal enthusiasm. The physical structure of the vessel begins to warp and twist as the laws of reality break down, metal flowing like liquid, corridors folding in on themselves, the entire decks compressing into impossible geometries that the human mind was never designed to comprehend. The crew, those who are not killed outright by the demonic incursion, find themselves exposed to the raw, unfiltered presence of the warp, and the effects on the human psyche are devastating. Madness descends like a curtain. Mutations erupt across previously healthy flesh. Memories become weapons, turned against their owners by entities that feed on fear and suffering and despair. Some ships are destroyed outright. Their hulls crack open and the warp rushes in like water through a breach in a dam, dissolving everything within to its base components and scattering the atoms across the Immaterium like dust in a windstorm. These are the lucky ones in a sense, because for them the suffering is over quickly. Others are not so fortunate. Some ships, through some quirk of fate or some caprice of the warp's unknowable currents, are not destroyed. Instead, they are carried, swept up by the tides of the Immaterium, and pulled along like leaves caught in a river, tumbling and spinning through that dimension of nightmare, with no control over their destination and no hope of escape. Their warp drives may still be partially functional, sputtering and misfiring in ways that keep the ship from being fully absorbed by the Immaterium, but that also prevent it from translating back into real space. Their Geller fields may be degraded, but not entirely gone, creating pockets of relative safety within the vessel where the worst effects of warp exposure are held at bay, if only barely. Their crews may still be alive, some of them huddled in whatever protected spaces they can find, praying to whatever gods they believe in for salvation that will never come. And so the ship drifts, for years, for decades, for centuries. It moves through the warp like a piece of flotsam in a storm-tossed ocean, pulled this way and that by currents that no mortal mind can predict or understand. And as it drifts, it accumulates. Other lost ships, caught in the same currents, are drawn toward it by the same forces that govern the movement of all matter in the Immaterium. They collide, they merge. Their hulls fuse together under the influence of energies that have no analog in the physical universe. Metal bonding to metal, corridors connecting to corridors, compartments opening into compartments that were never meant to be part of the same vessel. The resulting mass grows larger with each addition, its gravitational pull increasing, its profile in the warp becoming more prominent, attracting still more debris, still more lost ships, still more fragments of a galaxy that has been losing things to the warp for as long as there has been a galaxy to lose them from. Asteroids are pulled in, chunks of planetary debris, fragments of space stations and orbital platforms, pieces of alien vessels from races that may no longer exist, ships built with technologies that humanity has never encountered and cannot begin to understand. All of it fuses together, pressed and compressed and welded by forces that operate on a scale that dwarfs anything in the material universe, until what remains is no longer recognizable as a collection of individual objects. It is something new, something that has never existed before and will never exist again in quite the same form. As it is a space hulk, the process can take an incomprehensibly long time. The space hulk, known as the Gallodark, one of the most well-documented examples in Imperial records, began its existence as a funeral vessel belonging to a race called the Skoran Igsti. Over millions of years, it accumulated ships and debris from hundreds of different civilizations, growing and changing and evolving, if that word can be applied to something that is not truly alive, into a colossal structure that contained examples of technology from virtually every spacefaring race in the galaxy. By the time it was encountered by Imperial forces, no trace of that original funeral vessel remained. It had been broken down and absorbed into the greater mass of the hulk, its materials scattered throughout a structure that had grown beyond all recognition from its humble origins. And this is important to understand, because it speaks to something fundamental about the nature of space hulks. They are not static objects. They are not fixed in form or composition. They are constantly changing, constantly growing, constantly rearranging themselves in ways that are dictated by forces that no one fully understands. The warp does not merely transport these things. It shapes them. It molds them. It breathes something into them that is not quite life, but is not quite the absence of life either. Something that gives them a quality that the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus have struggled for millennia to define, and that the more superstitious among the Imperium citizens simply call cursed. What the random nature of warp currents means that space hulks appear in real space without warning and without pattern. One might emerge from the Imperium in a remote, uninhabited system, where it poses no threat to anyone and is noticed only by the automated sensor arrays of the Imperial Navy, which dutifully log its appearance and add it to the vast database of known space hulks that is maintained by Sector Command. Another might materialize directly in the path of a major shipping lane, its enormous bulk disrupting trade routes and threatening the safety of civilian vessels that cannot maneuver quickly enough to avoid it. Still, another might drop out of the warp in orbit around an inhabited world, its mass large enough to alter the planet's tidal patterns, and its presence close enough to represent a clear and immediate danger to the billions of souls below. And when a space hulk appears near an inhabited system, the Imperium must act, because the hulk is never empty, it is never safe. And if it is allowed to remain, if its contents are allowed to spill out onto the surface of a populated world, the consequences can be catastrophic. But we will talk about those contents soon enough. First, let us step inside and see what the physical reality of a space hulk looks like for those unfortunate enough to call one home. The interior of a space hulk is a place that defies easy description, not because the individual elements are difficult to understand, but because the way they combine creates an environment so alien, so profoundly different from anything that exists in the normal, ordered world of Imperial civilization, that words feel inadequate to the task. It is as though someone took the interiors of 1,000 different buildings, from cathedrals to cargo holds, from engine rooms to living quarters, from medical bays to ammunition magazines, and then crushed them all together without regard for logic or geometry or the basic principles of structural engineering, and then left the resulting mess to marinate in darkness and decay for a few thousand years. The corridors are the first thing you notice. They stretch away in every direction, some of them wide enough to drive a rhino transport through, others so narrow that a man in full power armor would have to turn sideways to pass. Some are straight, are running for hundreds of meters without a bend or a junction, their walls lined with the faded markings of whatever ship they once belonged to. Others twist and curve in ways that make no spatial sense, turning back on themselves or spiraling upward or downward at angles that seem to defy gravity. Many are blocked by debris, collapsed ceiling panels, or the compressed remains of bulkheads that have been crushed together by the immense pressures that act upon the hulk's interior. Navigation is not merely difficult, it is, for all practical purposes, nearly impossible without specialized equipment and extensive prior mapping, neither of which are typically available to anyone who finds themselves inside one of these things involuntarily. The atmosphere, where it exists at all, and is a toxic cocktail of gases that has been produced by centuries of chemical interaction between the various materials that make up the Hulk's structure. Oxygen is present in most areas, but it is thin and unreliable, mixed with carbon dioxide and methane and hydrogen sulfide, and a dozen other compounds that can cause anything from mild disorientation to rapid unconsciousness to painful death, depending on the concentration and the duration of exposure. Some sections of the Hulk have no atmosphere at all. Their corridors open to the vacuum of space through breaches in the outer hull that have never been sealed. Others have atmospheres so dense and so heavily contaminated that they are essentially unbreathable, even with basic filtration equipment. The temperature varies wildly from one section to another, as in areas near functioning reactors or engine cores, where residual energy still leaks from systems that have been running on automatic for centuries, the heat can be intense enough to cause heat stroke in unprotected humans within minutes. In the outermost reaches of the Hulk, where the cold of the void seeps in through gaps in the hull, temperatures can drop far below freezing, turning moisture in the air into frost that coats every surface in a thin, glittering layer of ice. Between these extremes, there are zones of relative comfort, pockets where the temperature hovers somewhere within the range that human beings can tolerate without too much difficulty. These pockets are precious, and they are fiercely contested by whatever creatures happen to call the Hulk home. Gravity is another variable that cannot be taken for granted. Some sections of the Hulk retain their original artificial gravity generators, still functioning after all these years, thanks to the robust engineering of the Adeptus Mechanicus, or whatever alien race built the ship in question. In these areas, gravity behaves more or less as expected, pulling objects and people toward the deck with a force that approximates what you would experience on the surface of a standard Imperial world. But in other sections, gravity is non-existent, the generators having failed long ago, leaving everything in a state of weightlessness that makes movement disorienting and combat nearly impossible. And in still other sections, the gravity behaves in ways that are simply wrong, pulling in unexpected directions or varying in intensity from one step to the next, the result of damaged generators interfering with one another, or the lingering influence of warp energies that have seeped into the physical structure of the Hulk. The Gallo Dark, that ancient and well-documented Hulk we mentioned earlier, was known to have areas where gravity behaved in a seemingly random fashion, shifting direction and intensity without warning or pattern. Exploration teams reported the unsettling experience of walking along a corridor only to have gravity suddenly shift 90 degrees, sending them tumbling sideways into what had, a moment before, been a wall, but was now, for all intents and purposes, the floor. Mapping these gravitational anomalies was one of the primary tasks assigned to the Imperial Navy breacher teams that were sent aboard the Gallo Dark. But it was a task that could never be truly completed. Yes, because the anomalies themselves were not stable. They moved, they changed. They appeared and disappeared with a capriciousness that suggested something more than mere mechanical malfunction. And then there is the water. It sounds strange, perhaps, to talk about water inside a space hulk, but it is one of the more surreal and unsettling aspects of these environments. Over the centuries, as different ships are absorbed into the hulk's structure, their water supplies leak out and accumulate in the lower reaches of the interior, forming pools and streams and, in some cases, actual rivers of liquid that flow through the corridors and chambers, following paths dictated by the local gravity and the lay of the terrain. This water is almost never clean. It is contaminated with chemicals from leaking engine coolant systems, biological waste from whatever organisms are living in the hulk, rust from decaying metal surfaces, and 1,000 other pollutants that make it toxic to virtually all forms of life that were not specifically adapted to thrive in such conditions. And yet, life does thrive. In the stagnant pools that collect in the deeper chambers of a space hulk, entire ecosystems can develop, miniature biospheres populated by organisms that have evolved in the absolute darkness and the chemical soup of the hulk's interior. Bacteria and fungi are the most common, forming mats and colonies on every available surface, their metabolic processes contributing to the already toxic atmosphere and breaking down organic matter into forms that can be utilized by other organisms further up the food chain. Larger creatures exist as well, though describing them accurately is difficult because they vary so enormously from one hulk to another, each population having evolved independently in response to the unique conditions of its particular environment. In the Gallowdark, exploration teams documented the existence of enormous rodent-like creatures that had adapted to the darkness by developing echolocation and bioluminescent patches on their skin, presumably to attract mates or warn rivals. Deformed arachnid predators stalked the corridors on legs that could span the width of a hallway, their webs strung across junctions and doorways like organic tripwires that could entangle an unwary human with alarming efficiency. There were things that might once have been insects, but had grown to the size of dogs, their chitin thick enough to turn aside a knife blade, their mandibles strong enough to chew through cable insulation and thin metal sheeting. There were other things too, things that the exploration teams chose not to describe in their reports, things that the Adeptus Mechanicus classified and sealed under the highest levels of clearance, things that suggested the warp's influence on the hulk's biology went far deeper than anyone was comfortable acknowledging. The sound environment inside a space hulk is almost as disorienting as the visual one. Sound travels strangely through the interconnected corridors and chambers, bouncing off metal surfaces and traveling along ducts and conduits to emerge in locations far removed from their point of origin. A footstep taken in one section of the hulk might be heard as a distant thud in another section hundreds of meters away, filtered and distorted by its journey through the structure until it is barely recognizable as a human-generated sound. Conversations carry, screams carry further, and beneath it all, constant and inescapable, there is the metallic groaning of the hulk itself, the sound of its constituent parts pressing against one another, settling and shifting and rearranging in response to forces both physical and metaphysical. This groaning is one of the things that the survivors speak about most often, those rare individuals who have been extracted from space hulks after spending time living within them. They describe it as maddening, a sound that never stops, that has no rhythm or pattern, that seems to come from inside their own skulls rather than from the walls around them. It is, they say, like listening to something enormous, trying to speak in a language that the human ear cannot quite pass, words that are almost recognizable, but that dissolve into meaningless noise the moment you try to focus on them. Some survivors insist that there are actual words buried in the groaning, messages from the machine spirits of the dead ships that make up the hulk's body, or whispers from the entities of the warp that have seeped into the structure over the millennia. Others dismiss this as the product of sleep deprivation and psychological stress, the mind's natural tendency to find patterns in random noise when it is desperate for some kind of meaning in an environment that offers none. The light, or rather, the absence of it, is the final and perhaps most significant environmental factor. The vast majority of a space hulk's interior is in total darkness, the lighting systems of the original ships having failed long ago, and no natural light sources being available to replace them. Exploration teams bring their own light, of course. Powerful lamps and illumination devices that can cut through the gloom like knives, but even the brightest lamp feels inadequate in the face of the Hulk's darkness. The corridors seem to eat light, absorbing it into their walls and floors and ceilings until the beam of your lamp is reduced to a pale circle of illumination that barely extends beyond arm's reach. Shadows cluster in every corner and crevice, dense and impenetrable, and you can never shake the feeling that something is watching you from just beyond the edge of your light. For those who live inside the Hulk permanently, without the benefit of Imperial-grade equipment, the darkness is absolute and unending. They learn to navigate by touch, by sound, by the subtle differences in air pressure and temperature that distinguish one corridor from another. They develop other senses too, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that senses which are normally suppressed by the dominance of vision come to the fore in an environment where vision is useless. Some long-term inhabitants of space hulks have been observed to possess an uncanny ability to detect the presence of other living beings at distances that seem impossible, as an awareness that may be partly explained by heightened sensitivity to sound and vibration, but that some Imperial scholars have attributed to the development of rudimentary psychic abilities in populations that have been exposed to warp energies for extended periods. This is the world that exists inside a space hulk. This is the environment in which everything else that we are about to discuss takes place. It is a world of darkness and toxicity and instability and constant, unrelenting danger. A world where the basic necessities of survival, air and water and warmth and food, cannot be taken for granted and must be fought for every single day. And yet, as we will see, life finds a way. Even here. Even in this most hostile of environments, creatures adapt and populations grow and civilizations of a sort take root. Oh, because that is what life does. It persists, it endures, it claws its way forward through whatever obstacles are placed in its path, driven by an imperative that is older than thought and stronger than fear, even in the belly of a dead leviathan drifting through the nightmares between the stars. The warp does not merely carry space hulks through its currents, it stains them. It leaves its mark on every surface, every atom, every molecule that has spent time immersed in the Imperium, and that mark does not fade when the Hulk translates back into real space. It lingers, it seeps, it whispers. This is perhaps the most insidious danger that a space Hulk presents to anyone who enters it. Not the darkness, which can be illuminated, not the toxic atmosphere, which can be filtered, not the unstable gravity or the shifting corridors or the freezing temperatures, all of which can be mitigated with the right equipment and the right training. The real danger is the corruption, the slow, subtle, patient corruption that the warp leaves behind on everything it touches, a contamination that works not on the body, but on the mind, not on the flesh, but on the soul. Consider what happens to a ship that spends an extended period in the warp without a functioning Geller field. The physical effects are dramatic and immediately visible. The warping of metal, the mutation of organic matter, the manifestation of demonic entities. But the psychic effects are more subtle and, in many ways, more devastating. The crew members who survive the initial exposure find that their thoughts begin to change. Their perceptions shift. Things that would have horrified them before, acts of violence, betrayals of trust, surrenders to base impulse, begin to seem reasonable, acceptable, even desirable. The warp does not break the mind through brute force. It erodes it, wearing away the barriers of morality and sanity, like water wearing away stone, so gradually that the victim does not realize what is happening until it is far too late. Now imagine that process playing out not over days or weeks, but over centuries, over millennia. That is what happens inside a space hulk. The warp energies that permeate its structure are not strong enough to cause immediate, dramatic effects in most cases.
Honestly, this is one of the things I love most about this corner of the lore. Space Hulks don't get nearly enough attention compared to, say, the Horus Heresy or the Primarchs. But I genuinely think they're one of the most creative ideas Games Workshop ever came up with. The whole concept just hits different. It's cosmic horror meets haunted house meets submarine thriller, and every time I go down the rabbit hole researching these things, I find something new that just makes me sit back and go, yeah, that's terrifying. If you've played the Space Hulk board game or the Deathwing on PC, you already know what I mean. That claustrophobic feeling never really leaves you. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
They are not concentrated enough to manifest demons or trigger physical mutations in healthy individuals, at least not right away. But they are there, constant and inescapable, a background radiation of psychic contamination that works on everyone and everything within the Hulk, with the patience of deep geological time. The walls of the corridors absorb this energy and radiate it back, creating a psychic environment that is perceptibly different from the psychic environment of normal, uncorrupted space. Even individuals with no psychic sensitivity at all can feel it. A vague sense of unease, of wrongness, of being watched by something that exists just beyond the threshold of perception. For those with psychic abilities, the effect is far more pronounced. Psychers who enter space Hulks report a sensation of pressure, as though the walls of the Hulk are pushing inward against their minds, are trying to force their way through the barriers of discipline and training that protect a trained psyker from the influences of the warp. The temptation to lower those barriers, to open oneself to the flood of psychic energy that surrounds them, is reportedly intense and grows stronger the longer one remains inside the Hulk. The long-term effects on human populations that reside within space Hulks for extended periods are well documented, at least in the classified archives of the Inquisition. Mutation rates are dramatically higher than baseline human norms, with each successive generation showing more pronounced deviations from standard physical templates. Extra digits, unusual skin coloration, bony growths, elongated limbs. In some populations, the mutations have progressed far enough that the individuals in question would be unrecognizable as human to an outside observer, their bodies having been reshaped by the constant warp exposure into forms that reflect the chaotic, unpredictable nature of the energies that have been acting upon them. But the physical mutations are, in many ways, the least concerning. It is the mental and spiritual changes that truly terrify the agents of the Inquisition, because those changes are not always visible from the outside. A person whose body has been mutated by warp exposure is easy to identify and easy to deal with, by the standards of the Imperium's rather blunt approach to such matters. A person whose mind has been twisted by the warp, whose moral compass has been quietly recalibrated by centuries of exposure to psychic contamination, can look perfectly normal on the outside while harboring thoughts and impulses that would make a chaos cultist blanch. This is why populations rescued from space hulks are invariably subjected to the most rigorous screening that the Inquisition can provide, and why many of them, perhaps most of them, are ultimately deemed unfit for reintegration into imperial society. The taint goes deep. It cannot be removed by prayer or by penance, or by any of the other spiritual remedies that the ecclesiarchy typically prescribes for those who have been exposed to the influence of chaos. It is part of them, woven into the fabric of their being at a level that is below conscious awareness. And the Inquisition has learned through long and bitter experience that a population that has been steeped in warp corruption for centuries is a population that can never be fully trusted, no matter how sincerely its members may profess their loyalty to the Emperor. Time, too, behaves strangely within the confines of a space hulk, and this is another aspect of the warp's influence that contributes to the surreal and disorienting nature of the environment. The warp does not respect the linear flow of time as it is experienced in the material universe. Within the Imperium, time can run faster or slower than it does in real space, or it can run backward, or it can stop entirely, or it can flow in directions that have no analog in human experience. Or ships that enter the warp for what their crews perceive as a journey of days or weeks Sometimes emerge to find that centuries have passed in the material universe. Others emerge before they left, arriving at their destination years or even decades before the calendar says they should have departed. Inside a space hulk, these temporal anomalies are even more pronounced. Different sections of the hulk may experience time at different rates, so that an hour spent in one corridor might correspond to a day, or a week, or a year in another corridor only a few hundred meters away. Explorers have reported entering chambers where the decay of the contents suggests that thousands of years have passed since the last human presence, only to find in an adjacent chamber evidence of activity that appears to be only days old. Clocks and chronometers are unreliable inside a space hulk, their mechanisms affected by the same temporal distortions that affect everything else. And even biological clocks, the internal rhythms that tell a human body when to sleep and when to wake and when to eat, can be thrown into disarray by prolonged exposure to the hulk's warped time stream. For those trapped inside a space hulk, this temporal instability has profound psychological effects. The loss of any reliable sense of time removes one of the fundamental anchoring points of human consciousness. Without the regular cycle of day and night, without the steady progression of hours and minutes that gives structure to daily life, the mind begins to drift. Memories become unreliable. The past and the present blur together. It becomes difficult to distinguish between events that happened recently and events that happened years ago, or between events that actually happened and events that were merely imagined or dreamed. Combined with the physical hardships of the environment and the constant psychic pressure of the warp contamination, this temporal disorientation can push even the strongest minds toward the edge of sanity. And for many, the edge is not a place they come back from. The whispers are the worst part, according to those who have survived. The half-heard voices that seem to come from the walls, or from the darkness just beyond the reach of your light, or from inside your own head. They speak in languages that you do not recognize, but that you somehow understand, or almost understand. Yet the meaning hovering just beyond your grasp like a word on the tip of your tongue that you cannot quite remember. They offer things: knowledge, power, comfort, release. They tell you that the darkness is not your enemy, that the cold is not your enemy, that the loneliness is not your enemy. They tell you that the only enemy is your own resistance, your stubborn refusal to accept the truth that is all around you, the truth that the universe as you understood it was always a lie, and that the reality behind the lie is so much more vast and so much more beautiful and so much more terrible than anything you ever imagined. Most people who hear the whispers learn to ignore them, or at least to tune them out to the point where they can function. But some do not. Some listen, some answer. And those who answer the whispers of the warp rarely remain what they were before. In the darkness of a space hulk, there are many things that wish to kill you. Toxic atmospheres, structural collapse, gravitational anomalies, the slow, insidious corruption of the warp. But of all the dangers that lurk within the labyrinthine corridors of these drifting leviathans, none is more feared, none is more infamous, and none has claimed more lives than the creature known as the Genestealer. The Genestealers are the vanguard organisms of the Tyranid race, that vast alien species that exists as a single galaxy-spanning hive mind, bent on the consumption of all biological matter in the known universe. They are, in many ways, the perfect infiltration organism, and designed by the hive mind, over countless generations of biological refinement, to be the ultimate tool for softening up a target world before the arrival of the main Tyranid fleet. They are fast, they are strong, they are intelligent, possessed of a cunning that goes beyond mere animal instinct and approaches something that might, in a generous assessment, be called tactical thinking. And they are patient, inhumanly, impossibly patient, capable of entering a state of hibernation that allows them to survive for centuries without food or water, their metabolic processes slowed to a rate that is barely distinguishable from death, waiting in the darkness for the moment when prey comes within reach. Space hulks are the primary vector by which Genestealers spread across the galaxy. The process is deceptively simple. A single genestealer, or a small brood of them, stows away aboard a ship that is subsequently lost in the warp and absorbed into a space hulk. Once aboard the hulk, the genestealers find a suitable location deep within the structure, a dark chamber with a stable atmosphere and a defensible entrance, and they settle in to wait. They enter their hibernation state, their bodies growing cold and still, their chitin-covered forms blending into the debris and the shadows until they are virtually indistinguishable from the inanimate objects around them. And they wait. They might wait for decades, for centuries, for longer still. It does not matter. Time means nothing to a hibernating genestealer. They do not dream. They do not age. Or at least not at any rate that matters. They simply exist in a state of suspended potential. It a loaded weapon waiting for someone to pull the trigger. And the trigger, inevitably, is pulled. A space hulk drops out of the warp near an inhabited system. A boarding party is dispatched to explore its interior. Soldiers, brave and well-trained and equipped with the finest weapons and armor that the Imperium can provide, enter the corridors of the hulk and begin their sweep. They are looking for valuable technology, for lost artifacts, for anything that might be of use to the Imperium's war effort. They are also looking for threats, and they know, because they have been briefed, that genestealers are a possibility. But knowing that genestealers might be present and actually being prepared for the experience of encountering them are two very different things. The first sign is usually a sound, a skittering, like claws on metal, coming from somewhere in the darkness ahead, or behind, or above. The acoustics inside a space hulk make it almost impossible to determine the direction of origin with any precision, and by the time the boarding party has identified the sound and oriented themselves toward it, the genestealers are already moving. They flow through the corridors like water, their six-limbed bodies covering the ground with a speed that seems impossible for creatures of their size, using walls and ceilings as readily as floors, their claws finding purchase on surfaces that would offer no grip to a human hand. They are silent when they want to be, and loud when silence would serve no purpose. The skittering sound is deliberate, a psychological weapon designed to create fear and confusion in the moments before the attack. When the attack comes, it comes from everywhere at once. Genestealers do not line up and charge. They do not announce their presence with war cries or battle songs or any of the other behaviors that human warriors use to steel themselves for combat. They simply appear, erupting from ventilation shafts and maintenance crawlways and the gaps between crushed hull plates, their rending claws already striking before the target has had time to register their presence. A genestealer's claws are among the most devastating melee weapons in the galaxy, capable of slicing through ceramite power armor with the ease of a hot knife through butter. Their molecular structure and the speed of the strike combining to defeat defenses that would shrug off bolter rounds and energy weapons with equal contempt. In the close confines of a space hulk's corridors, where there is no room to maneuver and no clear line of fire, and no opportunity to use the kind of long-range firepower that would give an Imperial force a decisive advantage in open terrain, the genestealer is supreme. It is faster than anything it is likely to encounter, more agile, more adaptable, and possessed of a physical strength that belies its relatively lean frame. A single genestealer can tear through a squad of ordinary soldiers in seconds, its claws opening throats and puncturing skulls and ripping through body armor like tissue paper. A brood of them, a dozen or more working in concert under the psychic coordination of their shared hive mind, is a force that even space marines in Terminator armor, the most heavily protected infantry in the entire Imperium, approach with caution and respect. But the most severe genestealer infestations that the Imperium has documented have been found aboard space hulks, not in 2s and 3s, but in their thousands, in their tens of thousands. The Sin of Damnation, perhaps the most notorious space hulk in Imperial history, was estimated to contain approximately 40,000 genestealers when it was finally cleansed by the Blood Angels chapter. 40,000 in a single hulk. The implications of that number are staggering when you consider that it takes only a single genestealer reaching an inhabited world to potentially doom the entire planet's population. The Blood Angels had learned this lesson the hard way. 600 years before their successful cleansing of the sin of damnation, the entire chapter had deployed to cleanse an unnamed space hulk in the Socorus system. They were not prepared for what they found. The genestealer infestation was so vast, so deeply entrenched, so overwhelmingly numerous that the Blood Angels were driven back, corridor by corridor, chamber by chamber, their ranks thinning with every engagement until only 50 battle brothers remained alive out of the entire chapter. It was a disaster of epic proportions, a stain on the chapter's honor that would take 6 centuries to wash clean. When the sin of damnation appeared near the Blood Angels' homeworld of Bile in 589 of the 41st Millennium, the chapter saw an opportunity to redeem that ancient shame. Under the command of 1st Company Captain Michaelis Raphael, 80 Blood Angel Terminators, the chapter's most experienced and heavily armored veterans, boarded the Hulk and began a systematic campaign of extermination that is still studied in military academies across the Imperium. It was a masterpiece of close-quarters combat, a testament to the skill and courage and sheer bloody-minded determination of the Adeptus Astartes at their finest. But it was also a reminder of the terrible price that must be paid when genestealers are allowed to establish themselves in such numbers. For those trapped inside a space hulk alongside an active genestealer population, life is an exercise in constant, paralyzing terror. The genestealers are always there, always watching, always waiting. They know the Hulk better than any interloper ever could, having spent centuries learning its corridors and passages and hiding places. They can hear you coming from hundreds of meters away. Their senses are tuned to the vibrations that travel through the Hulk's metal structure with a clarity that human ears cannot match. And they are patient. So incredibly, mercilessly patient. They do not always attack on sight. Sometimes they observe. Sometimes they follow, tracking their prey through the corridors for hours or days, learning their patterns and their habits and their weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This behavior is not random. It is strategic. The genestealer hive mind, that distributed intelligence that connects every genestealer to every other genestealer through a psychic network that operates below the level of conscious thought, is constantly gathering information, constantly analyzing, constantly adapting its approach based on what it learns. Every encounter with prey is a learning opportunity, and the knowledge gained is shared instantly with every other genestealer in the brood. For the human survivors who eke out an existence in the less infested sections of a space hulk, the genestealers are the monsters in the dark, the things that live in the places where the light does not reach, and that come for you when you are asleep or distracted, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. They learn to avoid the areas where the genestealers are most active, to travel in groups, to maintain constant vigilance, and to never, under any circumstances, venture into the deep corridors alone. But these precautions are only partially effective, because the genestealers are not confined to specific areas. They roam, they explore, or they extend the boundaries of their territory in a slow but relentless expansion that pushes the human survivors into ever smaller pockets of relative safety. And there is another danger that the genestealers pose, one that is perhaps more insidious than the physical threat of their claws and their speed and their numbers. The genestealer does not simply kill its prey, it can also infect them, implanting a genetic payload through a process known as the genestealer's kiss, that rewrites the victim's DNA and brings them under the psychic influence of the brood. Infected individuals become vectors for the further spread of the genestealer bloodline, their offspring carrying genestealer genetic material that expresses itself in progressively human-looking hybrids over subsequent generations. These hybrids form the basis of genestealer cults, as secretive organizations that worship the genestealers as divine beings and work tirelessly to prepare their host world for the eventual arrival of the tyrannid hive fleet that the cult's psychic beacon will summon. Inside a space hulk, where there is no inquisition to root out the signs of infection and no adeptus arbites to enforce quarantine protocols, this process can proceed unchecked. Human populations that have been living alongside genestealer infestations for centuries may be thoroughly compromised without even knowing it. Their bloodlines so deeply infected with genestealer DNA that they are, for all practical purposes, part of the brood. They still look human mostly. They still think of themselves as human mostly. But their loyalty is no longer to their fellow humans, or to the Emperor, or to any of the other authorities that govern life in the Imperium. Their loyalty is to the brood, to the hive mind, to the great devourer that waits in the darkness between the stars and hungers for worlds. Think about what that means for a moment. Imagine you are a human living inside a space hulk, part of a small community that has managed to carve out a precarious existence in a section of the hulk where the air is breathable and the gravity works, and the genestealers seem to stay away most of the time. You have grown up in this place. You have never seen the sky. You have never felt sunlight on your skin. The world, as far as you know, consists of metal corridors and recycled air, and the dim, flickering light of salvaged lumen strips that cast more shadows than illumination. Your parents told you about the Emperor, about the Imperium, about the world outside the walls, but those stories feel as distant and as unreal as fairy tales. The only world that matters is the one you can touch and taste and smell. The world of cold metal and stale air, and the ever-present sound of the hulk settling around you like a sleeping giant turning in its bed. You know about the genestealers. Everyone knows about the genestealers. They are the monsters in the dark, the reason you never go into the deep corridors alone, the reason your community maintains a watch at all hours and reacts to any unusual sound with the kind of explosive, adrenaline-fueled urgency that only comes from a lifetime of living on the edge of predation. You have seen what they do. You have seen the bodies, or what is left of them, after a genestealer attack. You have lost people you cared about to those claws and that terrible, inhuman speed, and you carry the grief of those losses like a weight in your chest that never quite goes away. But what you do not know, what you cannot know, is that the woman who sits next to you at the communal meal, the one with the kind eyes and the quiet voice who always saves a portion of her ration for the children, was infected 3 generations ago. Her grandmother was taken by a genestealer in the deep corridors and returned 2 days later, seemingly unharmed, with a gap in her memory that she could not explain. Nobody thought much of it at the time. People went into the deep corridors and came back changed all the time. It was part of life in the hulk. But the seed had been planted, and it had been growing ever since, passing from mother to daughter to granddaughter in a chain of genetic corruption that was invisible from the outside, but that was, in its own quiet way, far more devastating than any claw strike. The woman with the kind eyes is not malicious. She does not hate you. She does not wish you harm. But when the brood calls, when the patriarch sends its psychic summons through the network that connects every infected individual, she will answer. She will open the barricades. She will guide the genestealers through the defenses. She will stand aside and watch as the creatures she has been unknowingly serving pour into the settlement. And she will feel, in that moment, not horror, but a profound sense of relief, and as though a burden she did not know she was carrying has finally been lifted from her shoulders. This is the genestealer's greatest weapon, not its claws, not its speed, not its terrible patience. Its greatest weapon is trust, the trust of the people it has infiltrated, the trust that is betrayed so completely and so silently that the victims do not even realize they have been betrayed until it is far too late. If the genestealer represents the silent, patient predator of the Space Hulk's ecosystem, then the orc represents its polar opposite, the loud, boisterous, utterly irrepressible force of nature that treats the Hulk not as a prison or a hunting ground, but as a playground, a workshop, a launching pad for the greatest adventure a greenskin could ever hope to find. Orcs love space hulks. They love them with the same uncomplicated or wholehearted enthusiasm that they bring to everything in their lives, which is to say, loudly, violently, and with a complete disregard for the opinions of anyone who might disagree. For a race that views the entire galaxy as a source of amusement and a provocation to combat, a space hulk is something close to paradise. It is an enormous, floating collection of things that can be salvaged, repurposed, bolted together, and turned into weapons of various kinds, from crude firearms to ramshackle vehicles to entire war machines assembled from the cannibalized parts of a dozen different ship systems. It is a mobile fortress, a base of operations that can be used to launch raids and invasions against whatever unfortunate worlds happen to be in the Hulk's path when it drops out of the warp. And, best of all, it is almost certainly inhabited by something that wants to fight, which means the orcs do not even have to wait until they reach their destination to start having fun. Orcs use space hulks as their primary method of interstellar travel, and this is one of the facts about the greenskin race that most confounds Imperial strategic analysts. The Imperium spends enormous resources maintaining its fleet of warp-capable warships, each one a cathedral of technology and faith, crewed by thousands of trained specialists, and protected by Geller fields, and guided by the psychic abilities of navigators. The orcs, by contrast, simply pile onto the nearest space hulk in whatever numbers they can manage, fire up whatever engines happen to be working, point the whole contraption in a direction that seems promising, and hope for the best. The remarkable thing is that it works, not reliably, not predictably, not in any way that a sane strategist would consider acceptable, but it works often enough that orc-infested space hulks represent one of the most significant threats to Imperial security in the galaxy. When a space hulk carrying a large population of orcs drops out of the warp near an inhabited system, the result is almost always catastrophic. The greenskins pour out of the hulk like water from a burst dam. Their ramshackle warships and teleportation devices and crude drop pods, carrying millions of howling, bellowing warriors to the surface of whatever world is closest. And the fighting begins immediately and does not stop until either the orcs are exterminated or the planet falls. As the space hulk that carried the greenskins to the hive world of Armageddon during the Second War for Armageddon was crewed by the forces of the legendary orc war boss Gazgakul Mag Uruk Thraka, one of the most dangerous and strategically capable orc leaders in recorded history. The Hulk, known as the World Killer, had originally been a wreck in orbit around the orc world of Urk, but Gazgakul had claimed it and populated it with his forces, transforming it into a mobile invasion platform that he used to launch one of the most devastating attacks on an Imperial world in recent memory. The invasion of Armageddon was a disaster of the First Order, requiring the deployment of multiple Space Marine chapters and vast numbers of Imperial Guard regiments to contain, and its effects are still being felt generations later. A life aboard an orc-infested space hulk is, from an orc's perspective, just about the best time you could possibly have. The greenskins established settlements within the Hulk's structure, crude but functional communities built from salvaged materials and populated by the full range of orc society, from the lowliest Gretchen to the most powerful war bosses. Mech boys, the orc equivalent of engineers, spend their time rummaging through the Hulk's innards in search of useful components, and the variety of technology available inside a space Hulk that has accumulated ships from dozens of different races and eras is enough to make even the most jaded mech boy squeal with delight. Weapons are built, vehicles are assembled, engines are repaired, or at least modified to the point where they function after a fashion, though the word function is being used very loosely here. The orc's innate psychic ability, the collective field of psychic energy generated by their combined belief that is sometimes called the power of the green tide, plays a crucial role in making space Hulk travel possible for them. Orc technology should not work. By any rational analysis of its construction and design, it should not function at all. The engines are held together with wire and hope. The weapons are assembled from incompatible parts that have no business being in the same room together, let alone welded into a single device. The navigational systems, such as they are, consist of a weird boy, an orc psyker, sitting in a room and getting a headache until he points in a direction and says that feels right, and yet, it's because the orcs collectively believe that their technology works. It does. The psychic field generated by their belief bridges the gaps in engineering and physics and makes the impossible merely improbable. This same psychic field also provides a degree of protection against the warp that is analogous, in a very rough and imprecise way, to the protection provided by a Geller field on an Imperial vessel. As long as the orcs are confident, as long as they believe that they are tough enough and mean enough and green enough to handle whatever the warp throws at them, the warp seems to agree. Demons that manifest aboard an orc-infested space hulk tend to have a rather shorter lifespan than demons that manifest aboard other types of vessel, because the orcs do not react to their presence with the fear and despair that demons feed on, or they react with enthusiastic violence, treating the demonic incursion as just another opportunity for a good fight. And the combination of their physical resilience and their psychic field makes them surprisingly effective at dealing with threats that would paralyze or destroy a human crew. For anyone who is not an orc, however, an orc-infested space hulk is one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. The greenskins are not discriminating in their choice of enemies. Anything that is not an orc is a potential target for violence, and the orc's definition of violence covers a very broad spectrum of behaviors, from playful roughhousing that would kill a normal human to systematic extermination campaigns conducted with the same cheerful enthusiasm that they bring to everything else. Human survivors trapped in a space hulk alongside an orc population find themselves in a constant state of evasion, staying one step ahead of roaming mobs of greenskins who treat the hunt as a recreational activity. The noise alone is a significant hazard. Orcs are not a quiet species. Their settlements within the hulk are a constant cacophony of bellowed arguments, hammering metal, the roar of poorly maintained engines, the discharge of weapons being tested, often on live targets, and the peculiar rhythmic chanting that serves as the orc equivalent of music. This noise travels through the hulk's corridors for enormous distances, making it difficult for other inhabitants to determine exactly where the orcs are at any given moment, and creating a persistent auditory backdrop that compounds the already significant psychological stresses of life inside a space hulk. When the Imperium discovers that a space hulk is infested with orcs, the response is typically more forceful than it would be for other types of infestation. Imperial doctrine recognizes that orc populations, once established, are extremely difficult to eradicate due to the biological resilience of the species and the speed at which they can reproduce. If the strategic situation does not permit a thorough cleansing operation, the preferred option is often the outright destruction of the hulk, which is itself an enormously difficult task given the sheer size and durability of these structures. And even the devastating firepower of a Nova cannon, the most powerful ship-mounted weapon in the Imperial arsenal, is often insufficient to destroy a space hulk outright. If the orcs represent chaos of the jovial, bellowing variety, then the actual forces of chaos, capital C chaos, the ruinous powers and their servants, represent something far more sinister. Where the orcs are loud and obvious and straightforward in their violence, the followers of the dark gods are subtle, insidious, patient. They do not simply occupy space hulks. They corrupt them. They reshape them. They transform them into instruments of the Dark God's will, weapons that can be deployed against the Imperium with devastating effect. The relationship between chaos and space hulks is ancient and deeply intertwined. Many of the ships that form the core of a space hulk structure were originally lost to the warp during failed transit attempts, and as we have discussed, time spent in the warp without the protection of a functioning Geller field invariably results in exposure to the corrupting influence of the immaterium. The longer a ship spends in the warp, the deeper the corruption goes, until the boundary between the physical structure of the vessel and the psychic energies of the Imperium becomes blurred to the point of being meaningless. Some space hulks are home to populations of chaos worshippers who have been living within the hulk for generations, their ancestors having been crew members on ships that were swallowed by the warp and transformed by its energies. These populations have, over the centuries, developed their own cultures and belief systems centered around the worship of one or more of the chaos gods, their faith reinforced by the palpable presence of the warp that permeates every surface and every breath of air within the hulk. They practice rituals that would horrify any right-thinking citizen of the Imperium, blood sacrifices and demonic summonings, and acts of devotion that blur the line between worship and atrocity. They mark their bodies with the symbols of their chosen gods and mutilate their flesh in ways that they believe bring them closer to the divine. The Space Hulk, known as the Fury, provides a particularly chilling example. Originally a project of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Fury was intended to be a planet transformed into a spacefaring vessel, its own molten core serving as an energy source. The project went catastrophically wrong when the planet became lost in the warp, and over the millennia, it accumulated additional debris and became a space hulk. The original Mechanicus crew survived within the core of the Hulk, eking out a pitiful existence for thousands of years. But when the Space Marines of the Viridian Consuls settled on the Fury during the Abyssal Crusade, the touch of chaos corrupted them, transforming them into the heretic warband known as the Broken. The Fury became a mobile fortress for these traitor Astartes, its corridors patrolled by warriors who had once sworn oaths of loyalty to the Emperor, but who now served the Dark Gods with a fervor born of centuries of corruption. The Cauldron-born, another notorious space hulk, was claimed by the Blood Gorgons chapter of Chaos Space Marines and subjected to experiments in biological fusion and demonology that transformed it into something that was no longer entirely a ship and no longer entirely alive. The hull of the floating fortress was reportedly grafted with the flesh of a demon prince, and organic matter was cultivated to merge with the ship's engines, spawning a demonic spirit that inhabited the vessel's circuitry. It was a marriage of machine and demon, of steel and corruption, that produced something uniquely terrible, a space hulk that was not merely infested with chaos, but that had become an instrument of chaos itself. But the most dramatic example of chaos, forces weaponizing space hulks, came during the recent Arcs of Omen campaign, when the daemon known as Vashtor the Archiphane entered into an alliance with Abaddon, the Despoiler, the War Master of Chaos. Together, they developed a process for transforming ordinary space hulks into colossal warships called Arcs of Omen, each one a weapon of devastating power that could be deployed against the Imperium's forces with precision and purpose. The construction of the Arcs of Omen was a massive undertaking. Vashtor pulled several space hulks into real space within the dark half of the galaxy, and Abaddon assembled warbands of Chaos Space Marines to clear whatever infestations, Genestealer, Orc, or otherwise, lurked within them. Once the hulks were cleansed, Vashtor went to work, using his mastery of techno-sorcery to install control systems that could steer the hulks through the warp, weapons batteries that could level entire fleets, and captive warp portals that served a mysterious and terrifying purpose known only to Abaddon and Vashtor themselves. The resulting vessels were each unique, but all shared certain characteristics. They were enormous, they were heavily armed, they were infused with demonic power, and they were piloted by nightmarish entities called ferrymen, created by Vashtor's technology from the Hulk's own corrupted machine spirits. The Arcs of Omen were deployed across the galaxy, each one commanded by a champion of chaos and accompanied by a flotilla of heretic vessels. Their mission was to seek out and recover fragments of a mysterious artifact known as the Key, a weapon of such power that Abaddon believed it could be used to destroy the Imperium once and for all. The campaign that followed was one of the most devastating assaults on Imperial space in recent memory, with the Arcs cutting a swathe of destruction across multiple sectors and engaging Imperial forces in dozens of separate engagements. The Arcs of Omen campaign demonstrated something that the Imperium had always suspected, but had never seen proven on such a dramatic scale: that space hulks, properly harnessed and directed, could serve as weapons of strategic importance, capable of projecting power across enormous distances and of sustaining military operations that would be impossible for conventional warships. It was a terrifying revelation, one that forced Imperial strategists to reassess their entire approach to the space hulk threat and to devote significantly more resources to the tracking and, where possible, and the preemptive destruction of these drifting leviathans. For those who find themselves inside a chaos-corrupted space hulk, the experience is qualitatively different from being inside a hulk that is merely old and decayed. The corruption is visible, tangible, inescapable. The walls are covered with sigils that seem to writhe and pulse with their own inner light, symbols of the dark gods that have been carved into the metal by hands that may not have been entirely human. The air carries the scent of incense and blood, and something sweet and cloying that catches in the back of the throat and refuses to leave. Sounds echo in ways that defy the acoustics of the space, whispers and chanting, and the distant, discordant ringing of bells that seem to come from everywhere at once. And there are daemons, not always, not everywhere, but in the deepest, most heavily corrupted sections of a chaos-infested hulk, the barrier between the material universe and the warp has been worn so thin that entities from the Imperium can manifest and sustain a physical form for extended periods. These demons range from minor entities, barely sapient creatures of malice and hunger that haunt the shadows like predatory animals, to greater demons of terrifying power and intelligence that rule over their domains within the hulk, like feudal lords over conquered territory. The presence of demons within a space hulk creates an additional layer of danger that compounds every other hazard. Unlike genestealers, which are physical creatures that can be killed with sufficient firepower, demons are entities of pure warp energy that cannot be permanently destroyed by conventional means. Where killing a demon's physical form simply banishes it back to the warp, where it will reform and eventually find its way back to the material universe. The only true defense against demonic incursion is faith, and faith, as we have discussed, is a commodity in short supply inside a space hulk where the very air you breathe is saturated with the corrupting influence of the warp. Imagine walking through a corridor of a chaos-corrupted space hulk. The light from your lamp, whatever kind of light you are carrying, does not behave the way it should. It bends around corners that are not there. It pools in areas where the floor should be flat, but where some invisible depression seems to collect the illumination like water in a low spot. Shadows move independently of any light source, sliding along the walls with a liquid, a purposeful quality that makes them feel less like the absence of light and more like the presence of something dark. The temperature fluctuates wildly, from uncomfortably warm to bone-achingly cold, sometimes within the space of a single step. The metal of the walls is warm to the touch, warmer than it should be, and if you look closely, you can see patterns in its surface that were not machined or welded or formed by any process that you can identify. They look almost organic, like the whorls and ridges of a fingerprint scaled up to the size of a room, and they pulse with a faint luminescence that is the wrong color for any light source you have ever seen. It is not quite red and not quite purple and not quite black, but something that exists in the spaces between those colors, and a shade that the human eye was not designed to perceive, and that the brain does not quite know how to interpret. And then there are the sounds. Not the groaning of metal that you find in every space hulk, but something else, something more deliberate, a low, rhythmic chanting that seems to come from behind the walls, from inside the walls, as though the metal itself has developed vocal cords and is using them to sing a hymn in a language that predates human civilization. The chanting rises and falls in intensity, sometimes barely audible, sometimes loud enough to make your teeth ache, and it follows a pattern that is almost recognizable, like a melody that you heard once in a dream and that you have been trying to remember ever since. This is what chaos corruption looks like from the inside. But this is the lived experience of being in a place where the warp has seeped so deeply into the physical structure that the boundary between matter and spirit has become meaningless. It is not the dramatic, explosive horror of a full-scale demonic incursion. It is something quieter, something more insidious, something that works on you slowly, gradually, the way rust works on iron, eating away at your certainty and your sanity and your sense of self, until you are no longer entirely sure where you end, and the corruption begins. The followers of chaos who inhabit these spaces have long since stopped noticing. For them, the pulsing walls and the singing metal, and the shadows that move of their own accord, are simply part of the environment. No more remarkable than the color of the sky would be to someone who lives on the surface of a planet. But they have adapted to the corruption, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that the corruption has adapted them, reshaping their minds and bodies to be more compatible with the warp-saturated environment in which they live. They see the demons not as invaders or predators, but as neighbors, as fellow inhabitants of a world that operates according to rules that are different from the ones that govern the rest of the galaxy, but that are no less valid for being different. This is the final and perhaps most terrifying truth about chaos corruption. It does not feel like corruption from the inside. It feels like liberation. It feels like waking up. It feels like seeing the world clearly for the first time, like having a veil removed from your eyes that you never knew was there. And that is why it is so dangerous. And why the Inquisition treats it with such uncompromising severity, because a person who has been truly and deeply corrupted by chaos does not know that they have been corrupted. They believe, with absolute sincerity and total conviction, that they have found the truth. And against that kind of certainty, arguments and evidence, and even the threat of execution, are often powerless. Among the most pitiable of the Space Hulk's inhabitants are the humans, the descendants of crews and passengers aboard the ships that were swallowed by the warp and absorbed into the Hulk's ever-growing mass. These are the forgotten ones, the people who history has simply stopped counting, whose existence is known to no one outside the Hulk, and whose stories will never be told in the chronicles of the Imperium. They are born in darkness, live in darkness, and die in darkness, and the only world they will ever know is the one that exists within the metal walls that surround them. The original crews of the ships that form a Space Hulk's core would have been, for the most part, ordinary Imperial citizens, men and women who served aboard military vessels or civilian transports, or exploration ships, or any of the other countless types of spacecraft that ply the void between the stars. When their ships were lost, they would have done what humans always do in desperate situations. They would have survived. They would have found the safest areas of the ship, the sections with the most breathable air and the most stable gravity and the most defensible access points. They would have rationed their food and water. They would have maintained their equipment to the best of their ability. They would have prayed to the Emperor for deliverance, and when deliverance failed to come, they would have prayed for strength, and when strength began to fail, they would have prayed for mercy. And eventually, they would have accepted their situation and begun the long, slow process of adaptation that transforms a crew of shipwreck survivors into a permanent population, and then a culture, and then a society, and then something that can no longer be easily categorized by the standards of the civilization from which they originally came. The first generation would have remembered the Imperium, would have remembered the Emperor and the ecclesiarchy and the rituals of worship and obedience that gave structure and meaning to their lives. They would have passed these memories on to their children, or along with whatever practical knowledge they possessed about the operation and maintenance of the ship's systems. But with each successive generation, the memories would have faded, worn thin by the relentless passage of time and the inevitable degradation that occurs when knowledge is transmitted orally rather than in writing, in darkness rather than in light, under conditions of constant stress and scarcity, rather than in the orderly classrooms of the Schola Progenium. Within a few generations, the original culture of the Imperial crew would have been transformed almost beyond recognition. The Emperor would still be worshipped, perhaps, but in forms that would be unrecognizable to a Ministorum priest. The rituals would have changed, adapted to the realities of life inside the Hulk, and incorporating elements drawn from the survivors' own experiences and from the strange, half-understood influences of the warp that permeates their environment. The technology of the ship would have been repurposed, cannibalized, jury-rigged into forms that serve the immediate needs of survival rather than the original purposes for which it was designed. The social structures would have shifted, reorganized around the practical necessities of life in a closed, resource-scarce environment, where the ability to find food and water and defend a section of corridor against intruders is worth far more than rank or birth, or any of the other markers of status that mattered in the world above. After centuries, after millennia, the descendants of those original survivors would be essentially a new human subspecies, adapted to the specific conditions of their particular section of the Space Hulk in ways that set them apart from baseline humanity. Their eyes, assuming they retain functional eyes at all, would be adapted to the darkness, their pupils permanently dilated, and their sensitivity to even the faintest light sources dramatically enhanced. Their lungs would be adapted to the thin, toxic atmosphere, capable of extracting oxygen from air that would incapacitate or kill an unacclimatized human within minutes. Their bodies would be wiry and lean, shaped by a lifetime of inadequate nutrition and constant physical activity. And their minds would be shaped by the peculiar psychic environment of the Hulk, their thoughts running along channels that were formed by the constant background pressure of warp contamination, their perceptions colored by the whispers that they hear in the walls, and the dreams that come to them in the fitful sleep that is the only rest their environment allows. The settlements that these populations establish within the Hulk are remarkable in their ingenuity, even if they are heartbreaking in their poverty. Using whatever materials are available, which in a Space Hulk means primarily metal salvaged from the surrounding structure, they build shelters and defenses and rudimentary infrastructure. They cultivate the fungi and algae that grow in the stagnant pools, supplementing their diet with whatever animal life they can catch and kill, the rats and insects and other creatures that share their environment. They fashion tools and weapons from scrap metal, and they guard their territory with a ferocity born of knowing that every inch of safe space is precious, and that there are things in the corridors outside that would take it from them if they could. The daily rhythm of life in one of these settlements would be almost unrecognizable to an outsider. There is no day, there is no night. The markers that the inhabitants use to divide their time are arbitrary, based on the cycles of their own bodies, or on the rhythms of whatever functioning machinery they have managed to maintain. A shift might be marked by the periodic venting of a steam pipe, or by the flickering of a power conduit that follows a pattern that roughly approximates the hours of a standard Imperial day. Meals are eaten communally because food is too scarce and too precious to be hoarded individually. And the preparation of what passes for food is an art form in itself, a body of knowledge passed down through generations that details which fungi are safe to eat and which will kill you, which of the Hulk's water sources are drinkable and which are contaminated beyond any ability to filter, which of the small creatures that scuttle through the corridors are nutritious and which carry diseases that will rot your flesh from the inside out. Children are born in the dark and raised in the dark and taught, from the moment they are old enough to understand, that the dark is dangerous. They learn to move quietly because noise attracts attention, and attention attracts things that are better left unattracted. They learn to recognize the sounds that mean different things, the creaking of metal that indicates a structural shift, the hissing of escaping gas that signals a breach in a containment system, the skittering of claws on metal that means something is coming and that you need to hide, now, immediately, without hesitation. They learn the layout of their section of the Hulk with the kind of intimate, bone-deep familiarity that comes from a lifetime of navigating the same corridors in total darkness. Their mental maps so detailed and so precise that they can find their way from any point to any other point without ever needing to open their eyes, assuming their eyes work at all. The social bonds within these communities are intense, forged in the crucible of shared hardship and maintained by the constant awareness that survival depends on cooperation. Disputes exist, of course, because where there are people there are disputes, but they tend to be resolved quickly and sometimes brutally, because a community that is divided against itself is a community that is vulnerable to the things outside, and the things outside do not wait for internal conflicts to be resolved before they attack. Leadership is earned through demonstrated competence, through the ability to find food and water and safe routes through the corridors, through the willingness to stand between the community and danger, and to absorb the blows that would otherwise fall on those who are less capable of absorbing them. Stories are told. In the absence of written records, which are virtually impossible to maintain in an environment with no light and no writing materials, the oral tradition becomes the primary means by which knowledge and culture are preserved. Elders tell tales of the founding, or of the ancestors who first arrived in this section of the Hulk and carved out the space that their descendants now occupy. They tell cautionary tales about the deep corridors, about the things that live there, and the people who went into them and never came back. They tell myths about the world outside, about the emperor who sits on a golden throne and protects his people from the darkness, and about the day when his servants will come and open the walls and lead the faithful out of the Hulk and into the light. These myths bear only a passing resemblance to the actual theology of the imperial ecclesiarchy, having been filtered through hundreds of generations of oral transmission and adapted to the specific realities of life inside the Hulk. The emperor, in these stories, is often described not as a god or a ruler, but as a craftsman and a builder of ships and corridors and the kinds of safe, enclosed spaces that the inhabitants of the Hulk understand. The afterlife is not a paradise of light and glory, but a perfectly sealed chamber with clean air and working gravity, and enough food for everyone, and walls that are thick enough that nothing can get through them. Heaven, for a people who have never seen the sky, is simply a room where you can sleep without fear. The Gallodark, that well-documented Hulk, was home to numerous human settlements scattered throughout its enormous structure. One of these, a place known as Iron Shanty, was described in imperial records as something approaching a neutral zone, a settlement where the usual rules of constant conflict and territorial defense were relaxed at least to a degree. As he built around the original vessel that had been lost in the warp and subsequently fused with the Gallodark, Iron Shanty served as a trading post and meeting ground for the various populations that inhabited the Hulk, a rare oasis of relative peace in a world defined by violence and scarcity. But Iron Shanty was the exception, not the rule. Most human settlements inside space hulks are insular, suspicious of outsiders, and governed by customs and laws that would seem barbaric to anyone accustomed to the relative order of imperial civilization. Tribal structures are common, with authority vested in the strongest or the most cunning or the most ruthless, rather than in any formal system of governance. Disputes are settled by violence more often than by negotiation, and the concept of individual rights, to the extent that it exists at all, it is subordinated to the overriding imperative of group survival. The relationship between these human populations and the other inhabitants of the space hulk is complex and varies enormously from one hulk to another. In some cases, humans coexist with genostealers in a relationship that might charitably be described as an armed truce, each population staying out of the other's territory through mutual recognition that the cost of conflict would be too high for both sides. In other cases, the human population has been so thoroughly infiltrated by genostealer hybrids that the boundary between the two groups has essentially ceased to exist. The humans unknowingly serving as hosts for a genostealer cult that has been growing in their midst for generations. In hulks where orcs are present, as the human populations tend to exist in a state of permanent subjugation, pressed into service as labor or entertainment by the greenskins, who find the smaller, weaker humans amusing in the same way that a child might find a particularly spirited insect amusing. The orcs do not generally go out of their way to exterminate the human populations within their territory, not out of any sense of mercy, but simply because the humans are useful in ways that dead humans are not. They can be put to work doing the kinds of tedious, repetitive tasks that orcs find boring. They can be used as scouts, sent ahead into unexplored sections of the hulk to trip whatever traps or trigger whatever defenses might be waiting there. And, in a pinch, they can be used as food, a fact that the human populations are acutely and permanently aware of. The most tragic aspect of these trapped populations is their invisibility. The Imperium does not know they exist. No census counts them. No administratum records list their names. No ministorum priest tends to their spiritual needs. They live and die in the spaces between the pages of history, their entire civilizations rising and falling without anyone outside the walls of their metal world being aware of it. When a space hulk is finally boarded and cleansed by Imperial forces, the discovery of a living human population within is almost always treated as a problem, rather than a cause for celebration, because, as we have discussed, the corruption of the warp runs deep in those who have been exposed to it for so long, and the Inquisition does not take chances with corruption. Or when the Imperium determines that a space hulk must be cleansed, the task is typically assigned to the most elite forces available. This is not a job for the Imperial Guard, those brave but relatively fragile men and women who form the backbone of the Imperium's military. The cramped corridors, the unpredictable environment, the lethal enemies that lurk within, all of these factors demand warriors of exceptional skill, exceptional resilience, and exceptional faith. They demand Space Marines. More specifically, they demand Terminators. The Terminator is the pinnacle of Space Marine war gear, a suit of tactical dreadnought armor that transforms an already superhuman warrior into a walking fortress. Encased in layers of ceramite and adamantium, protected by energy fields that can deflect everything short of a direct hit from a laser cannon, are armed with weapons that can tear through the heaviest armor and obliterate the toughest enemies. The Terminator is the Imperium's answer to the most extreme close combat scenarios. And there is no close combat scenario more extreme than the interior of a space hulk infested with hostile organisms. The process of boarding a space hulk typically begins with a thorough sensor survey conducted from the ships of the approaching Imperial fleet. The survey identifies areas of the hulk where power signatures suggest that functioning equipment remains, areas where life signs indicate the presence of inhabitants, and areas where warp contamination is strongest. Based on this information, a boarding plan is developed that prioritizes the most strategically significant targets while minimizing the risk of ambush or entrapment. And the boarding itself is conducted using specialized assault craft, boarding torpedoes or Thunderhawk gunships that can punch through the hulk's outer hull and deliver their cargo of Space Marines directly into the interior. The moment of entry is one of the most dangerous points in the entire operation, because the boarding party is at its most vulnerable in those first few seconds, cramped inside the assault craft, disoriented by the impact and surrounded by unknown threats. Speed is essential. The Marines must disembark, establish a secure perimeter, and begin their advance before whatever is waiting for them has time to organize a response. The advance through the hulk's interior is a slow or methodical process that bears little resemblance to the sweeping maneuvers and aggressive charges that characterize Space Marine combat in open terrain. In the corridors of a space hulk, the primary weapon is patience. Every junction must be cleared before the advance can continue. Every room must be swept for hidden enemies. Every corridor must be checked for traps, for structural weakness, for gravitational anomalies, for all the countless hazards that the hulk's environment presents. Progress is measured in meters, not kilometers, and a single engagement with a determined enemy can stall an advance for hours. The Terminators move through the corridors in a formation that has been refined over millennia of practice, at a disciplined arrangement that maximizes their overlapping fields of fire while minimizing the number of angles from which they can be attacked. The lead Terminator advances with his Stormbolter raised, its muzzle tracking across the corridor ahead in a slow, steady sweep that covers every potential hiding spot. Behind him, his battle brothers maintain positions that allow them to fire past him without hitting him, their own weapons covering the flanks and the rear, watching for the telltale signs of movement in the shadows that indicate an incoming attack. Communication is sparse. Hand signals, whispered vox transmissions, the kind of wordless coordination that comes from decades of fighting alongside the same warriors in the same formation. They do not waste breath on unnecessary chatter. Our every word spoken is a word that might mask the sound of claws scraping against metal, or the whisper of air displaced by something moving fast in the darkness just beyond their light. Silence is a tool, as valuable in its way as any weapon in their arsenal, and they use it with the same discipline and precision that they bring to everything else. The environmental hazards compound the difficulty of every engagement. A corridor that seems clear might have a section of floor that has been weakened by corrosion, ready to collapse under the weight of a Terminator's massive armored form and send the warrior tumbling into whatever lies below. The air in a given section might contain concentrations of volatile gases that will ignite if exposed to the muzzle flash of a stormbolter, turning an ordinary firefight into a conflagration that threatens both attacker and defender. Magnetic anomalies can throw off targeting systems. Gravitational fluctuations can affect the trajectory of projectiles. And the constant, pervasive darkness means that even the enhanced senses of a space marine are working at a disadvantage, their auto-senses struggling to distinguish between genuine threats and the countless false positives generated by an environment that is designed, whether by accident or by malice, to deceive. Then there are the moments when the enemy comes. The Genestealers do not announce themselves with battle cries. They do not sound horns or bang drums or engage in any of the pre-combat rituals that sentient species typically use to prepare themselves for violence. One moment the corridor is empty, the next, it is full of death. They come from everywhere, erupting from vents and access panels and gaps in the walls that were not there a moment ago, their rending claws already slashing as they close the distance with a speed that makes the eye water. The first strike is always the most dangerous, because the Genestealers attack from the direction that the Terminators are least expecting, and even a momentary lapse in vigilance can result in a claw finding the gap between armored plates. The response is immediate and overwhelming. Storm bolters roar, their explosive rounds filling the corridor with a wall of shrapnel and fire. Assault cannons spin up to their maximum rate of fire, their rotating barrels pouring a stream of shells into the mass of alien bodies with a sound like tearing canvas, amplified to the point of pain. Power fists crackle with energy, their fields of force strong enough to crush ceramite, their strikes pulping Genestealer bodies with single blows that send sprays of alien ichor across the walls and ceiling. Flamers bathe entire sections of corridor in sheets of promethium fire, the sacred flames burning away chitinous bodies and illuminating the darkness with a flickering, hellish light that casts dancing shadows across every surface. In these moments, the corridor becomes a charnel house, a confined space filled with noise and light and death in quantities that would overwhelm any mortal soldier. The Terminators stand in the midst of it like statues, their armored forms absorbing impacts that would pulverize unprotected flesh, their weapons speaking their terrible language with a fluency that only centuries of practice can produce. And around them, the Genestealers fall, their broken bodies piling up in the corridors until the remaining aliens must climb over the corpses of their kindred to reach the warriors who are killing them. But the Genestealers keep coming. They always keep coming, because for every one that falls, two more are emerging from the darkness behind it, summoned by the brood mind's psychic command from nesting sites scattered throughout the hulk. The ammunition counters tick downward. The heat sinks of the weapons glow cherry red. The energy reserves of power fists diminish with every strike. And the Terminators, those peerless warriors, those champions of humanity, begin to feel something that they are trained never to show and never to admit. Something that the propaganda of the Imperium insists they are incapable of feeling. They feel the weight of the numbers against them. The famous cleansing of the sin of damnation provides the best documented example of how such an operation is conducted. Captain Raphael's plan was a masterpiece of precision, dividing his 80 Terminators into multiple squads with distinct objectives and coordinating their movements through the Hulk's labyrinthine interior with a level of skill that reflected centuries of accumulated Space Marine doctrine. The squads were tasked with securing key locations within the Hulk, disabling escape pods that the Genestealers might use to flee to nearby worlds, and methodically clearing sections of the Hulk in a pattern that prevented the enemy from concentrating their forces at any single point. The fighting was brutal and unrelenting, as the Genestealers were present in numbers that would have overwhelmed a lesser force, their attacks coming from every direction, from the corridors ahead and behind, from ventilation shafts above and maintenance tunnels below, from gaps in the walls and the floors and the ceilings that seemed to open specifically to allow the aliens to strike. The storm bolters and assault cannons of the Terminators filled the corridors with a continuous stream of fire, their explosive rounds detonating inside the Genestealers' bodies and spraying the walls with alien ichor. But for every Genestealer that fell, another seemed to appear, and the ammunition counters on the Marines' weapons ticked steadily downward with each engagement. In the end, the Blood Angels prevailed, but the margin of victory was narrower than the official reports might suggest. At the successful elimination of approximately 40,000 Genestealers by a force of 80 Terminators is a feat that has few parallels in Imperial military history, and it came at a cost in lives and ammunition and sheer physical and mental endurance that tested even the legendary resilience of the Adeptus Astartes. The Gallodark presented a different kind of challenge when it was boarded in a more recent era. Rather than a single chapter deploying its elite forces in a coordinated operation, the Gallodark attracted the attention of multiple factions simultaneously, including Imperial Navy breachers, mercenary Kroot warriors, Dark Eldar raiders, Necron kill teams, and others, all pursuing their own objectives within the Hulk's vast interior. The result was a multi-sided conflict of astonishing complexity, with shifting alliances and bitter rivalries playing out against the backdrop of the Hulk's treacherous environment. The Gallodark's story eventually came to an end when the Forge world of Beta Decima attempted to capture the Hulk using a massive graviton cannon, only for the enormous forces involved to break the Space Hulk apart entirely, raining debris across the Forge world and devastating it in the process. This incident underscored an important truth about Space Hulks that the Imperium has been forced to learn repeatedly throughout its history. These things are not merely hazards to be dealt with. They are forces of nature, vast and ancient and profoundly unpredictable, and any attempt to control or contain them carries risks that are proportional to their enormous scale. Throughout the long history of the Imperium, these certain Space Hulks have earned a level of infamy that sets them apart from the countless others that drift through the void unnamed and unremembered. These are the Hulks that have been the sites of great battles, great tragedies, and great discoveries, the ones whose names are recorded in the archives of the Inquisition and whispered in the mess halls of Imperial warships and carved into the honor rolls of Space Marine chapters that lost brothers in the attempt to cleanse them. The sin of damnation, which we have already discussed at length, is perhaps the most famous of all. Its story encompasses one of the greatest disasters in the history of the Blood Angels chapter, and one of their greatest triumphs, separated by 6 centuries of shame and determination. The Hulk's name has become synonymous with the Genestealer threat, a shorthand for the worst-case scenario that haunts every Imperial commander who receives a report that a Space Hulk has been detected in their area of operations. The World Killer, claimed by Gaz-Kul and his forces, demonstrated how a Space Hulk could be used as an instrument of invasion, its bulk crashing into the world of Armageddon and disgorging millions of Orc warriors in one of the most devastating attacks on an Imperial world in recent memory. The tale of young Gaz-Kul defeating a bloodthirsty daemon and sealing a warp rift with nothing more than his own thick skull is one of those stories that seems too outlandish to be true, even by the standards of Orc behavior. but multiple sources confirm the essential details. And the wreckage of the World Killer still litters the surface of Armageddon as a monument to the Greenskins' audacity. The Broken Back served as a mobile fortress for the renegade Soul Drinkers chapter after they were declared excommunicate by the Imperium. After cleansing the Hulk of a Genestealer infestation, the Soul Drinkers made it their home, using it as a base of operations for their guerrilla war against the forces of both Chaos and the Imperium. The Broken Back was, for a time, one of the few space hulks in recorded history to be inhabited by space marines, and its corridors bore witness to the internal struggles and ideological conflicts that defined the Soul Drinkers' tragic story. The Crimson Harvest was a hulk formed from the fused remains of alien vessels and artifacts of unknown origin, which appeared on the edge of the Hadex anomaly and immediately attracted the attention of Chaos forces. The Dark Forge world of Samek dispatched ships to rendezvous with the Hulk, leading to a series of running battles between Chaos and Imperial forces. The Hulk was eventually destroyed when Brother Sergeant Hurak of the Iron Hands led his Deathwatch kill team aboard and sacrificed himself to plunge it into the heart of a nearby star, an act of heroism that prevented the Crimson Harvest's unknown contents from falling into the hands of the enemy. The Lost Hope, located within the Eye of Terror itself, serves as the base of operations for the Crimson Slaughter, a warband of Chaos Space Marines whose descent into madness and corruption is one of the more disturbing tales in the annals of the traitor legions. Within the Lost Hope, as the boundaries between real space and the warp are essentially meaningless, the Hulk's interior transformed into a nightmarish landscape where demons walk openly, and the laws of physics are more like suggestions than rules. And then there are the Arcs of Omen, those weaponized space hulks that Vashtor the Archifani transformed into instruments of Abaddon's grand strategy. More than a dozen of these colossal warships were deployed in the initial wave alone, each one accompanied by a flotilla of Chaos vessels, each one commanded by a champion of Chaos, each one carrying within its corrupted hull a captive warp portal whose ultimate purpose was known only to Abaddon and Vashtor themselves. The campaign that followed shook the galaxy, drawing in forces from virtually every major faction and culminating in an assault on the Rock, was the Flying Fortress Monastery of the Dark Angels chapter that resulted in the return of the Primarch Lion L. Johnson, one of the most significant events in the recent history of the Imperium. The Arcs of Omen campaign demonstrated that the era of the Space Hulk as a passive hazard, a thing that drifted and threatened and was occasionally boarded and cleansed, was over. In the hands of a sufficiently powerful and imaginative adversary, Space Hulks could be transformed into active weapons of war, their enormous bulk and inherent durability making them ideal platforms for the projection of military power on a scale that few conventional warships could match. As we stand here, at the end of our journey through the corridors and chambers of these drifting leviathans, it is worth reflecting on what we have learned. A Space Hulk is not simply a collection of dead ships. It is a world unto itself, with its own ecosystems, its own populations, its own dangers, and its own dark wonders. It is a place where time runs differently, where reality is thin, where the boundary between the material universe and the nightmare of the warp is worn to gossamer fineness. It is a place where Genestealers hunt in the darkness, where orcs build their crude empires of scrap and violence, where chaos worshippers perform their terrible rituals in chambers lit by the flickering glow of warp fire, and where human survivors, the forgotten children of a galaxy that has long since stopped counting them, eke out their brief and brutal existences in the spaces between. It is, in short, one of the most uniquely horrifying environments in the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe. It's a setting that combines the claustrophobic terror of being trapped in a confined space with the cosmic dread of being adrift in a universe that does not care whether you live or die. And for those who find themselves inside one, whether by choice or by chance, or by the cruel caprice of the warp, the experience is one that marks them forever, assuming they survive long enough to carry those marks back into the light. The Imperium will continue to track the movements of known space hulks, as it has for millennia. It will continue to dispatch boarding parties to cleanse those that pose an immediate threat to inhabited systems. It will continue to lose soldiers and ships and resources in a struggle that can never truly be won, because space hulks cannot be eliminated. They can only be dealt with, one at a time, as they appear, and then watched as they disappear back into the warp, carrying their cargo of horrors to whatever destination the currents of the Imperium decree. And somewhere, in the darkness between the stars, new ships are being lost, new wreckage is being gathered, new hulks are being born, growing slowly in the depths of the warp, like tumors growing in the body of the galaxy, waiting for the moment when they will emerge into real space and begin their slow, ominous drift through the domains of the living. Think about that for a moment. Right now, as you listen to this, somewhere in the warp, a ship is losing its Geller field. Maybe it is a cargo freighter carrying grain to a frontier world. Maybe it is a military transport, ferrying a regiment of Imperial Guard to a war zone they will never reach. Maybe it is a pilgrim vessel, its holds packed with the faithful, making their once-in-a-lifetime journey to some holy shrine on a world they have dreamed about since childhood. Whatever it is, its Geller field is failing, and the warp is rushing in, and the screaming has begun. And when the screaming stops, what remains of the ship will begin its long, slow drift through the Imperium, collecting debris, growing larger, becoming something that it was never meant to be. Centuries from now, millennia from now, what is left of that ship will be part of a space hulk. Its corridors will be fused with the corridors of 100 other vessels. Its cargo holds will open into chambers that belong to ships built by races that do not yet exist. Its crew, or their descendants, or the things that their descendants have become after generations of warp exposure and isolation and the slow, patient work of corruption, will still be there, living in the darkness, breathing the poisoned air, listening to the whispers that come from the walls, and wondering, in whatever fragmentary way their altered minds are still capable of wondering, whether the world outside the metal walls is real, or just another story told by people who died a long time ago. And when that space hulk finally drops out of the warp, when it materializes in some star system without warning or explanation, the Imperium will respond as it always responds. A task force will be assembled, briefings will be conducted, plans will be drawn up, and some of the bravest, most dedicated, and most extraordinarily skilled warriors in the entire galaxy will board their assault craft and prepare to enter the hulk, knowing that the corridors they are about to walk have claimed the lives of countless others before them and will claim the lives of countless others after them, knowing that the darkness within is deeper than any lamp can illuminate and older than any memory can reach, knowing that they may not come back. They will go anyway, because that is what they do, because someone has to, because the alternative, letting the hulk drift, letting its contents spill out onto the surface of whatever world is closest, letting the Genestealers and the orcs and the demons and the heretics and all the other horrors that dwell within its body loose upon an unsuspecting population is simply not acceptable. Not to the Imperium, not to the Emperor, not to the warriors who carry the weight of humanity's survival on their ceramite-clad shoulders. And so the cycle continues. Space hulks emerge from the warp. Boarding parties go in. Some come back. Most do not. The hulks drift on, or are destroyed, or are captured and cleansed and turned over to the Adeptus Mechanicus for study. Their secrets extracted and catalogued and filed away in archives that only the most trusted servants of the Imperium will ever see. And then, eventually, inevitably, another hulk appears, and the whole process begins again. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from contemplating the existence of a space hulk. Not the loneliness of being alone in a room, or of being separated from people you care about, but the loneliness of scale. At the crushing realization that the universe is so vast, and so indifferent, and so full of things that are completely beyond your ability to control, or even comprehend, that your own existence, your thoughts, your feelings, your entire life, is barely a ripple on the surface of an ocean that stretches to infinity in every direction. A space hulk embodies that loneliness in physical form. It is a monument to everything that has been lost and will never be found, to journeys that were started and never finished, to hopes that were carried into the void and swallowed by the dark. And yet, even in this most desolate of settings, there is something that might, if you squint hard enough and tilt your head at just the right angle, pass for hope. Because the people who live inside space hulks, the forgotten descendants of long-lost crews, the mutant communities and the tribal cultures and the small, fierce civilizations that have sprung up in the spaces between dead ships, they are still alive. They are still fighting. They are still holding on with whatever strength they have and whatever tools they can find and whatever faith they can muster to the simple, stubborn, absolutely inexorable conviction that living is better than dying, even when the living is done in darkness, even when the living is hard, even when the living hurts. That, perhaps, is the most human thing about the Space Hulk. Not the metal, not the silence, not the vast and terrible emptiness that stretches away in every direction until it becomes indistinguishable from forever. The most human thing is the refusal to give up, the refusal to lie down, the refusal to accept that the darkness has won. And even when the darkness is all there is, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But in the belly of a Space Hulk, there is something worse than war. There is the waiting, the endless, patient, suffocating waiting, in darkness that has no end and silence that is never truly silent, for something to change, for something to happen, for salvation or for death, or for anything at all that might break the terrible monotony of an existence spent inside a tomb that will not let you rest. And there is something else too, something small and fragile and stubbornly persistent, like a candle flame in a hurricane. There is the human spirit, battered and diminished and worn down to its bare essentials by millennia of hardship and corruption and fear, but still burning, still fighting, still refusing, against all evidence and all probability and all common sense, to go out. That, perhaps, is the truest horror of the Space Hulk. Not the Genestealers, not the orcs, not the demons or the corruption or the toxic air or the failing gravity. Those things can be fought. Those things can, at least in theory, be overcome. But the waiting, the simple crushing weight of time spent in a place where time itself has lost its meaning, that is something that no weapon can defeat and no armor can protect against. And yet people endure it. They endure it because they are human, and humans endure. It is what we are. It is what we have always been. It is the one thing about us that the darkness, for all its patience and all its power, has never been able to take away. And it is that endurance, quiet and stubborn and absolute, as that makes the Space Hulk one of the most compelling and most deeply human concepts in the entire mythology of Warhammer 40,000. Because at its heart, the story of a Space Hulk is not a story about dead ships or alien monsters or the corrupting influence of an evil dimension. It is a story about us, about what we become when everything we know is taken away, about what we hold on to when there is nothing left to hold, about who we are in the dark, when no one is watching and no one will ever know. And the answer that the Space Hulk gives us again and again across 10,000 years of recorded history and countless more years of unrecorded survival in the spaces between the stars, is that we are more than the sum of our circumstances. We are more than the darkness that surrounds us, yet we are more than the fear that lives in our hearts and the corruption that whispers in our ears and the loneliness that settles over us like a shroud. We are the ones who keep going, even here, even now, even in the belly of a dead Leviathan drifting through the nightmares between the stars. We keep going. Thank you for spending this time with me in the dark. I hope you found it as fascinating and as deeply unsettling as I did. If you enjoyed this journey into the belly of the beast, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know, and it means that we can keep making these deep dives into the lore of the 41st millennium together. Until next time, stay safe out there, keep your Geller fields active, and whatever you do, do not answer the whispers in the walls. This has been Q on 40K, and I will see you in the next one.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.